Hey folks, welcome to another edition of PRIMO NUTMEG. This is your host Steve, and joining me tonight is one of my oldest and dearest friends, Chrispy.
Hey everybody.
So Chrispy, I appreciate you taking the time to drive up here, up to Colchester, and recording another edition of my podcast.
Oh, not a problem at all. I'm sure this is going to go great.
Well, I did want to talk with you about a few different things.
Really?
But
I didn't hear about that.
First off, I did want to ask you, did you see that Pats game last night?
I did not see the Pats game last night. What happened?
Well, it started off kind of rough. I don't know if you've been following the news, but Tom Brady is tentatively scheduled to get suspended. So they had the second string quarterback in there. I believe his name is Janine Garofalo.
Okay.
And yeah, he had kind of a rough start first half, but they came back in the second half, actually. The Saints scored like 21 unanswered points up until like the end of the second quarter, and at like the very end of the second quarter, the Pats scored a touchdown, and then they were able to come back in the second half. I just didn't know if you'd caught that game at all. You don't have cable where you live, huh?
No, I don't.
Do you guys? Yeah, but actually, that was on ABC. Do you guys watch regular sports ever? Or?
We don't have a lot of. We don't share in a lot of familial activities. You know, we don't even eat together. Whenever I eat in the kitchen, I usually just stand by the counter by myself and
Really?
hope for the best.
You eat at the counter?
Yeah. I like the feeling of standing as I'm eating for some reason. It's a habit that has developed over the past couple of years or so.
It's probably good for digestion, I would imagine.
Is it? I don't know. I
If
don't
you're
have like
standing while you're
a
eating?
nutritional angle behind it. I'm just really stuffy and cagey, and the dogs bother me, so I stand up while I eat.
On the subject of eating, I have to say, you've lost a lot of weight. You are very skinny.
Do you think so? I think it's the colors that I'm wearing, actually. I think the blue jeans and like the t-shirts that I get from my family really make me look more slender.
No, man. Like, I don't know. The past few years, I put on like 40 pounds. You've lost like, 30 pounds or so, probably.
Maybe. Well, I appreciate the compliment in any case.
Well, actually, one thing I did want to mention too, in the way of compliments, you took the time to come out to my Notre Dame MBA graduation back in May, a couple months ago.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to let you know I really did appreciate you making the way, halfway across the continent just to come see my graduation. Not a lot of friends would come do that, so it was very nice of you to take the time to make that epic voyage.
Well, I do enjoy traveling, so, any chance I can get to go and have an adventure or something, I'm typically down for taking.
Yeah, you were in Mexico last summer, right?
Yeah, I was.
Did you enjoy that trip?
I did. I got a lot out of it, but I've had a hard time talking about it for some reason. So whenever it comes up, it's like, oh,
Why?
this again. How am I going to fumble my way around this? I don't know. It was a very, a lot happened in a short span of time. So to kind of like, summarize it and stick it to bullet points is somehow to me seems to adulterate the experience of it. So I don't know. Yeah,
I think I kind of understand what you're talking about because oddly enough, during those 2 months that you were in Mexico, I was in Japan. And I think I kind of understand from the standpoint of it's so different in so many kind of profound ways. It's sort of like a feeling in a lot of ways, like weird feelings. Like if you go to like the grocery store there, it's just everything's a little bit different and it's off and it's kind of hard to explain. That's how I feel about it, at least.
Yeah, there's that part of it, but it's also, like the work. I was down there for. I was basically doing like a residential music seminar. So we would work. We all lived on a compound together, and we would work 6 days a week. And I was there for about 7 weeks. So it's not like something that people ordinarily do when they go to a different place. So that kind of compounds the difficulty of talking about it. So it's like, oh, what did you do last summer? I was like, oh, I was.
And just to clarify, you were there with a musical group, right?
Yeah.
And so you would practice all week and then you would go out and perform?
Well, we would live together and we'd work together and We actually only did one performance. We didn't go out and perform every week. We sort of worked with different themes and different sorts of projects amongst the groups.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about because it's not something, you know, typically people do. So how do you like explain it to people?
So what kind of place did you stay in? Were you like in a city or were you kind of out in the country?
Um, we were outside. We were about a half hour outside of Cuernavaca, which is a city about an hour south of Mexico City.
Okay, so it's a pretty heavily populated area, correct?
Mexico City? Oh yeah, like, and it's big too. Like you enter the city limits, and the airport is like in the middle of the city, and so you get to the city, and it's like we'll be at the airport in like a half hour, 40 minutes, like without traffic.
But you were
Like
kind
it's
of in
huge.
the greater metropolitan area, so it was still, I imagine there are a lot of people living where you were, correct?
Well, where I was wasn't too bad. Like there were, you know, it was definitely outside the city. Like it wasn't like an urban area. We were living on the a compound which is owned by a doctor who I think was friends with one of the facilitators of the projects. Who was I don't know, actually I don't know what kind of work he did. I saw in his study he had a lot of books on anthropology and homeopathy. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. But he was kind enough to let us stay on the and work on the compound for 7 weeks. So
So when you say compound, is it like a farm or something, or
it's not really a farm. It's just like a very big um, living space with like, you know, a kitchen and, you know, several residential buildings and like a ballroom,
how many
recreation
people
area
lived in the town that you were staying in, would you say?
in the town.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know. It's hard for me to say. I have a hard time with
Well,
like
is this like the size of
quantifying things.
Colchester? Was it the size of Middletown, Hartford, New York City?
Well, like I said, it was kind of like where we were was kind of like in between two cities. It wasn't really like in Cuernavaca. It was just almost as if you were driving down 149 here in Colchester. It actually, I passed by a spot that reminded me of in Mexico. You see a lot of places. They have a lot of the small businesses there are just people who like run it out of their homes. So you'll see
Right.
like restaurants that are it's just like somebody's house
Yeah.
with a sign, or like they'll sell curiosities or antiquities. And I passed by something like that on 149. I was like, oh, it's like I'm in Mexico again. But it's sort of like that, you know. So not super heavily populated.
So you said that you went out once a week and performed?
No, we had a day. There was a day off each week, so we would work for 6 days, and then we'd have a day off where we could like go out into the city and
Okay, so you kind of
wander
did
around.
sightseeing once a week.
Well, you could if you wanted to. You didn't have to. You could just stay. There were a couple of weeks where I stayed because I was just there were some weeks where I was just like so exhausted where
Yeah.
I like wouldn't want to go out and have like a big adventure
You know,
on
I
one
did that
day
in
off.
Japan too. I did a lot of sightseeing in Japan, but there were other days when I just was exhausted from work and just wanted to sit and watch YouTube all day. Actually, it was cool there because I guess there are different copyright laws in different countries, and if you try to watch Saturday Night Live on YouTube in the U.S., you can't watch them. Like there's a lot of skits on there. Most of the skits you can't watch, but if you go to Japan, you can watch all of them. They have like every SNL skit ever on YouTube. You just sit there all weekend or, all week if you wanted just watching SNL clips.
Really? That's interesting. I didn't really notice that with Mexico. I was on YouTube for a little bit when I was down there, but there wasn't any like extra content. It was just I just got more Spanish ads and
Right.
stuff. So, and I guess like you kind of lucked out in that regard.
So have you ever been to any other countries besides Mexico?
Well, as a tourist, I've been to Ireland.
That's right. You went to Ireland. I forgot about that. How was Ireland? Because I haven't been there and I really want to go.
It's a pretty neat place. Mm, I'd like to go back eventually at some point. There's a lot of I don't know. It's hard to describe. It's different. There's a lot of history there, I guess, that I'm not used to. Like being in the United States. So.
Yeah, that was the thing about Japan was especially Kyoto because um, actually in a lot of the cities I went to, they got bombed during World War II, and we didn't just nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We also dropped these conventional bombs on all these other cities and just devastated them.
Mm.
So in Nagoya, the city where I was, they have like the temples or castles there had to be rebuilt. Like they got destroyed in 1943 or whatever and had to get rebuilt. So in Kyoto, for whatever reason, we did not bomb that city during World War II. So every street corner almost was an ancient temple that's 1,000 years old. And
Yeah,
it's
just side by side with
right.
everything else.
And it's so strange because there's nothing that old in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean the closest you'll get is like colonial houses or something,
right?
and like if you're in Guilford or something. But yeah, it's weird, and there are a lot of places you can actually go inside and look around too. Like it's not sacrosanct. You can't. It's not like you're barred from going in. It's like, yeah, here's this ancient castle. Have a look around if you want. And, I imagine if I were like a teenager in Ireland and I like to go sauntering, I would go to a lot of these places and just kind of poke around or find a spot or something.
Did you go all over Ireland or did you just go to Dublin?
We went around a good part of it. We were in Dublin for a lot of it. We tried to go take a scenic route to Dingle, which is on the other side of the island, but the car we were renting broke down like along the way. But what we saw was, pretty breathtaking.
Yeah. I would really like to go there. And actually, I asked that because I've been to London and I've been to Paris, but only those two cities. Like I didn't get to see the rest of the UK and I didn't get to see the rest of France.
And what were you there for?
Just we actually I went on a vacation. This is like I don't know 12 years ago. Went with my mom and my grandma to London, and we actually took the Channel over to Paris, and we were there for like 12 hours. So it was a really quick kind of tour of Paris. We went to the Arc de Triomphe, the Notre Dame Cathedral, or Notre Dame Cathedral, I should say.
Does Paris smell as bad as all the writers like to say it does?
No, it was fine. I don't really remember any smells except for actually at the Eiffel Tower, there were some street vendors selling chestnuts or something like that. So it kind of had that aroma.
I remember Ireland being very clean. Like,
yeah,
it's a very clean place.
Japan was very clean too.
It's not like, has a lot of filth like, say, Middletown does. It's different.
Yeah. How about Mexico? Was Mexico clean?
Well, most of it, I would say, is like it's very messy. It's very sprawling. Like Mexico City is just like so big, but it's not. It doesn't. Most of the time, most places, it doesn't feel like a filthy place. It's not.
Yeah.
There's stuff everywhere, but people live pretty close to their means there. So there's some sense of like, there's still like a sense of order which comes out in like the cleanliness of the land, even though a lot of people there are very poor, like really poor. Like makes people living in the slummier parts of Middletown look like they have a pretty modest lifestyle by comparison.
On the other end of the coin, again, to compare this to Japan, I saw virtually no poor people there. I saw a few people that I guess were homeless in a park, but I got the feeling when I was there that everyone kind of had the same general income, or I guess that maybe it's people not really showing off because people kind of dress the same too. Like everyone would go to work wearing slacks and white shirts, or women would wear business suits. And there wasn't really a sense of, I could tell this person has a lot more money than that person, which was kind of odd, but I guess that's just the Japanese culture. And that's another thing too that I think is hard to relate to people that haven't been to Japan specifically.
Yeah.
Is and I didn't understand this till I went there either, is how different people can be in a society. Like, people are very polite there and kind of pathologically polite, trying very hard not to offend each other, trying to like, be quiet and inobtrusive,
Mhm.
and trying to explain that to people back in the US. I don't really know if they got it, because I wouldn't.
Where do you think the confusion comes across when you try to?
It's just when you're immersed in this culture, you're kind of used to it. You're
Yeah.
used to people yelling at each other, or seeing, if you go to a city, seeing people begging for change, or obesity. Just, there's these common problems that we have in the U.S. That are both subtle and overt, but I don't think you really realize them as much until you go somewhere else and come back, and then you kind of see where you come from with new eyes. I don't know if it was like that for you, coming back from Mexico. I don't know if there's certain things about the U.S. that you noticed for the first time.
Well, I mean, a lot of it was things that I kind of knew, but hadn't really experienced. So that when I came back, it was kind of like, oh yeah, that's what they were always talking about in those, whatever classes I was taking. But one of the things I noticed was when I got back, people were less friendly and more insular in the U.S. than they are in Mexico. Like I was at a restaurant and it was like there's more of a sense of like being like a group in Mexico, not in like a collectivist kind of way, but we're
Right.
all part of like a common
Yeah,
humanity.
and that was the feeling. I remember specifically being on this train, going to Tokyo, on one of these high speed, super fast trains, and just kind of like sitting around with people. It was this weird feeling of like we're all on the same team, sort of. And I don't really get that in the U.S. I kind of feel like everyone's sort of, suspicious of each other, or like guarded. It's
Oh
not
yeah,
really
for
like
sure.
we're on the same team.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's something that just has faded over the years, or if it's always been that way, but there's a pronounced difference if you go somewhere else. And I'm saying, even as a foreigner, and Japan specifically has a very they're very guarded against foreigners. They call them gaijin, and there are actually places it's segregated where gaijin are not allowed. I would try to go, and they'd put their arms up like an X, and they'd say no gaijin, no gaijin, and keep you out.
And that's not just Americans, that's like Chinese people too. And
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's just they have a strong sense of being Japanese, and they don't want non-Japanese people, and maybe that's a bad thing, but even with that, I felt that being out in society, it was kind of, there was a lack of, there was an absence of hostility, as in the US it's kind of like, people are ready to be mad at each other.
yeah, sort of like a rat race or something like that, I guess. Well, I don't know. I haven't been to Japan, but yeah.
But
I can see what you're saying.
you're saying Mexico was, everyone was kind of friendly also there.
Well, I wasn't working there, but it's, people are friendlier. I mean, I got a lot of funny looks just because, I didn't see as many other white people down there as I thought I would. Like I could maybe count the number on like two hands.
Mm.
So when, people saw me, like kids would like stare at me for a while, like this white guy, like what's his deal?
Yeah.
The word is guaro, I think it is, which means blondie.
Did you know that Louis C.K. grew up in Mexico?
I did know that actually.
Which is funny, because you kind of, with that goatee, you kind of look like him now.
I've been told I look like a scrawnier, less attractive, less funny, and less successful as Louis C.K. Isn't the first time. So I feel you on that.
So you've been to Mexico, you've been to
Mhm.
Ireland, any
Yep.
other countries?
Well, I stopped in like Bermuda and the Virgin Islands on a cruise once, but I don't think that really counts.
Yeah. Um, I've been all over the Caribbean, and it is kind of homogenous. At least there are tourist areas that are all kind of the same.
Right.
They're just, there's a beach, and there's guys trying to sell you necklaces or whatever. And
Bermuda was a little bit different. It was a little bit more English,
yeah.
but like the
Well,
Virgin
that's like out
Islands,
in the middle of the Atlantic, right? That's
yeah,
that's
it
off
was
the
kind
coast
of
of
like
North
a
Carolina or something.
right, sort of a triangular route down there. We got to, but the day we got there was like a big tropical storm. So by the time I got back to the boat, my clothes were soaked and my hair was blown back, and it was quite a fun time actually. I enjoyed it a lot, even though I'm kind of scared of ships and the way that ship was rocking. Ooh,
Are you
I
scared
don't
of
know.
ships?
I don't know. It's kind of an irrational thing. I'm kind of worried that they're gonna like flip over
Yeah.
because there's like nothing holding them up. So when the ship is like tossing back and forth, I don't get sick, like physically sick, but I do get kind of antsy.
Yeah. We all kind of have that, I guess. You know what it is for me, and I've had this ever since I was a little kid, is like the magnitude of the sky. This sounds like fucking crazy, I know, but like people sometimes will lie on their back and just look out into space and look at the stars,
Yeah.
Like I could get like kind of freaked out doing that.
Yeah, like a reverse vertigo. Like
Yeah.
you're looking up and it's just like so
And I've
much
had that
and-
feeling sometimes too, like, what if gravity just reversed? Like it's completely irrational, but you just, fly up into space. Like, did you see that movie? What the hell is the
No.
name of it? Gravity with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. You didn't see that?
I have not. No.
They're astronauts, and there's it's about space junk. There's this stuff all around the atmosphere, all this garbage from satellites or whatever.
Mhm.
It's flying around. So when astronauts go up into space, they have to plot their course around all this garbage that's floating around the planet. So something happens where, like, I don't know, some of it, like, I think Russia sends up something that explodes some space junk or something along those lines. So there's like a surprise storm of space junk that goes flying towards their shuttle, and it like screws them all up, and then they have to try to like get over to the space station and then get over to this other space station, and it's but the whole movie is out in space, and they're just floating out in space trying to like get to these other spaceships, and that's kind of what it's like, where I'm afraid I would just,
You don't think it'd be fun, at least a little bit, just to be in kind of a zero gravity environment?
Yeah, I'm sure that's fun, but I'm just, I guess what it is contemplating the magnitude of what there is in the universe, like the size of the universe.
Oh, scale. Yeah, scale always kind of weirded me out as a kid. When I was little, I had like a whale poster on my wall, which showed like the different whales species all kind of gathered in one spot, and
Right.
it had like a little human diver to give you a sense of the scale, and it always kind of made me feel not really like, I didn't really like dread it. It was kind of a funny feeling of like, whoa, that's kind of scary, and whoa, that's kind of cool at the same time.
Yeah.
And I do know people who are like scared of like space or talking about space because
I think
any of
because
this.
people can't contemplate infinity. And I've always had this feeling too of like imagining like infinite time,
Mhm.
and like getting like wrapped up in that idea, like what if time is infinite? And like it like blows your, like if you think about it too much, it really blows your mind. you
Yeah,
know?
it's kind of like thinking about what is consciousness like after death.
Yeah.
It's just like blackness. I don't know. What is it like to not be able to, it's a funny thought.
Yeah. I was told once though that anxiety about that stems from Western perceptions of time and space, where it's linear, whereas Eastern philosophy, it's more secular. We're kind of, it's like seasons, like winter leads to spring, leads to summer, leads to fall, leads to winter. It's a cycle where, in the West, we kind of think of time as a straight line that
Yeah.
goes from here to there, or would stretch out in an infinite manner in that case.
I haven't heard that, but it sounds plausible to me.
So, on that subject, I guess I did want to have you on here to talk about some kind of crazy ideas or different things that we've discussed over the years.
What? You didn't tell me that.
So,
Are we being recorded right now?
so we've been friends for a long time, and I remember discussing different like philosophies with you over the years, and I know that you've kind of picked up things over the years, as have I. And recently, though, we were having a conversation where you were talking about how a bunch of different philosophies or different things kind of relate to each other. Specifically, I was talking about the Myers-Briggs personality test, tarot cards. I think we were also talking about the one of the disciples or followers, or I phrase it, but of Gurdjieff. So I kind of want to talk about the relatedness between those. I don't know really where you might want to start with.
Okay.
How to pick that up.
Well, it's kind of like you have a big cheeseburger and you don't really, it's so big that you don't really know, where to take your first bite, because whatever you do, you're just going to wind up with like a face full of grease. And
Right.
but I guess the best place to begin with that thread would be just how I got interested in it in the first place.
Sure.
So it actually happened in Mexico toward the end of that project. It was during like a break in one of the sessions. Somebody said, "Oh, have you ever looked at this Myers-Briggs things? It's like a personality test." And I was like, "No, I haven't." And the guy, he was a friend of mine, a good friend of mine. He said, "Well, maybe it's." I tried it. It's actually very uncannily accurate. I thought. He's not really like a bullshitty kind of guy. So I was like, well,
Right.
maybe. So after a couple weeks after I got back, I must have had nothing to do that day or something. So I went on and I took a test and I got a result and I thought it was interesting. I think I am introspective enough that I am not liable to just sort of take something that like sort of says something vague and says, "Oh yeah, that's me." I think I have enough discrimination to that's there's a name for that actually. It's called the Forer effect, where it says, typically when you read astrologies, it's like, well, you're very strong-willed and you're persevere and you're willing to say what's on your mind and that kind of thing that somebody will read and just as like a general praise, like, yeah, I'm like that. But the things that I was picking up, because I looked at a couple different places, were very particular about certain kinds of things in a way which I thought was very interesting. And on top of that, in some of my other reading, I had encountered um, an idea regarding Jungian typology, which is the basis of the Myers-Briggs system.
Okay,
Which,
so that's based on Carl Jung, and he was a psychologist, correct?
yeah, he's probably behind Freud, the most influential
Right,
psychologist of the
and
20th
he
century.
was the one where he said there are different archetypes, right? That there's kind of like a collective consciousness, and there's these characters that keep emerging in our mythologies or something like that.
Yeah, the collective unconscious. He was the one who sort of pioneered that idea. So the collective unconsciousness is one of his big contributions to the way we think about psychology, and the other one is introversion and extroversion, which is so ubiquitous nowadays that we just kind of like take it for granted.
So
It's
he's
like,
the one that actually came up with that. Like,
yeah, he's
he's
the
an
one that sort of coined it and codified it into like a system.
okay.
So the Myers-Briggs is it's building on that. It's essentially like a simplification of his ideas. I think it was actually originally developed for women rejoining the workforce in the 50s
Okay.
as a way of like determining what they were compatible for in terms of like career paths and relationships and stuff like that. But I had seen this idea, the way it talked about the Jungian ideas in a specific way that I was not seeing in the community that is in various places online. Like there's a small YouTube community and there's like a Reddit community. So I just kind of found myself taking it further and further. And, a year later, I have some ideas about it.
So, apparently, this Myers-Briggs personality test is very well known, and I hadn't known about it until you had told me about it.
Mhm.
But I had asked other people who were in my MBA program, and they had heard of it before. And actually, when I was applying for jobs just a few months ago, I actually had a job where they wanted me to take a Myers-Briggs personality test.
Yeah. I was actually surprised about that because I was actually in New York City a couple weeks ago with a friend of mine who's from Taiwan, and I was talking to him, and he said, "Yeah, I mean, that stuff is taken seriously in some business environments," which was really a big surprise to me because it's basically, for all the hullabaloo about it or that I'm about to make about it, it's basically amateur psychology. It's not
Right.
like it'd be interesting if there were like a neuroscientific basis for it, but I'm not sure. So it's not like hard and fast, kind of like on the edge of, cognitive science or anything. But yeah, it's taken seriously.
So when you take this personality test, it asks you a bunch of questions about kind of preferences or what you're most likely to do in certain situations, stuff like that. And based on your answers to those questions, it gives you 4 letters. You're assigned 4 different letters. And I guess so one of those letters can either be I or E, correct, for introvert or extrovert?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And there's 4 different sets of those letters where it's either or.
Yes.
And based on that, there's 16 different personality types overall that you could turn out as, correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
So you've probably seen it before. Like people might say something. I'm talking to the audience, by the way, not you. They might say, "Oh, I took this test and I am ESTJ," or something like that. That's what we're talking about.
So, first of all, what are the 4 dimensions that they're looking at there? Because there's essentially four dimensions that's either or, correct? Like we just said, introvert or extrovert. So
Yes.
what are the other ones?
Well, after that, there is the second letter in the set refers to, what does it refer to? Oh, either N or S, which means intuitive or sensing. And I'll go into more detail about what these things mean. The third letter is either F or T, which is either feeling or thinking. And the fourth letter is J or P, which is judging or perceiving. So
okay. Well, can we go through those now? Because I understand. I know what introvert and extrovert means. It means either you keep to yourself or you're boisterous. Or I've heard one person put it one time as for introverts, it takes their energy away to be like in a social setting, to be like in a group of people, and it's taxing on their energy to be in that situation. Whereas an extrovert, like Shane, for example, would get a lot of energy from that and kind of be powered up by being in a group of people.
That's one way of looking at it. Although I personally have some qualifications about that, which I'll get to once I give like the more common explanations for it. So for now, we'll say that yes, that's what extroversion and introversion refers to.
Okay, so then just to go through them all. So the next one is, I'm sorry, what are the 2 again?
N or S, which means either intuitive or sensing.
Okay, so what does that really mean practically?
Well, in the Myers-Briggs system, which is a little bit different than Jung, which is a little bit different than how I look at it, and you can see why the amateur psychology part of this gets kind of hairy. It's referring to a person who relies primarily on, I think, hunches or like information which is not available to the senses, or a person who relies primarily on sensory information.
Okay.
So with the Myers-Briggs letters, I think that I think the purpose of them is to make it simplified. So the MBTI is really self-explanatory, like F and T, feeling or thinking. Well, are you a feeler or a thinker? It's not, that system is not very closely differentiated. It's not like extremely nuanced.
Okay.
Because it's meant to be, rapidly and easily understood. So, extroverted introversion, are you outgoing or are you kind of shy? Sensing, intuitive, do you rely on sensory information or do you rely on like hunches and, intuition for sure?
And feeling or thinking. What was the last one?
Judging or perceiving, like are you a judger? Do you like form conclusions about things and stick to them? Or are you a perceiver? Do you kind of like leave your options open? That kind of thing. So using those 4 letters, you can get a picture of like a personality type in your head. So you could say ESTJ is a person who's extroverted and relies on sensory information, is a thinker and likes to come to conclusions about things and stick to those, and rather than like leave things open and make messes and stuff like that.
Right. And that was, I guess that's kind of the point of it, is once you get assigned this set of 4 letters, it kind of paints this character where they even have titles for it. Like, I forget what my letters are. It's like
INFP.
INFP.
And it's not creepy that I memorized it right. It's kind of a hobby of mine. Like when people I know just saying, I wonder what they might be. And
so I'm an INFP, and the title I'd read for this somewhere was The Idealist,
Mhm.
and then it kind of paints this picture of, it's kind of like an artistic personality. They talk about like writers are often like
Yeah, a lot
that.
of writers are typically INFPs or supposedly INFPs.
And yours, for full clarification, it's the counselor, right? That's yours.
Yeah, I've heard it called it's INFJ. I've heard it called counselor.
So
I've also
we're one letter off.
one letter off, but they're actually structurally radically different personalities, which is one
Okay.
of the misleading things about the Myers-Briggs system, which I'll get to in a second. But I've also heard INFJ referred to as idealistic, like that being the title. So, different people have their own different, and I have my own, ways of remembering each of the 16 types too, which are different than all those. But yeah, so basically, for me personally, it's the whole thing is an approach to exploring and understanding a transcultural personality, if you will, kind of taking a leap off of our discussion of being in different countries. Like all these, so they're sort of patterns which underline our experience, which can be looked at sort of in a more detailed rather than less loose kind of way, even though they're just patterns.
Hmm.
So that's the MBTI system. It's pretty simple. And so when you take a test that asks you things like, and there are varying qualities of tests too, like it'll ask you things like, do you cry when you watch soap operas? Or are you on time for your appointments, or stuff like that, which are kind of superficial questions and kind of bad too, because like different types might answer things in a certain way, which might automatically make them look like a different type, but it's actually because they're acting from a specific kind of function, which makes them answer like that. Like a P isn't going to admit to being late to an appointment, for example. So they're going to say, yeah, I'm always on time. So it's going to make them look like a J. So
That's another thing too, is certain people would probably try to portray themselves as something different when they're taking this test, like their idealized self. Like,
Yeah.
if you cried at soap operas, well, no, I don't want to say I cry at soap operas.
Or they might say something to come off in a certain way, like,
Yeah.
do you really care about like human emotions, or are you all about the facts, or something like that? Like the perception will dominate like the actual behavior.
Right.
So it can be tricky. Usually if there's somebody, like if I persuade somebody to take a test, I like to have like another person there to like help sort of correct the flow of the process. Like and
Like
sometimes
help them answer questions.
Yeah, and people can get kind of suspicious sometimes, like, why do I need her help or his help to answer these questions about me? It's good to have around, just like as an objective, like, no, you're definitely a different set of eyes.
Well, what might help too, I think, is taking the test different places, because I know you can take it at different sources. Like, I've taken this 3 or 4 times and I get the same thing, So
Yeah, pretty sure about it. Yeah, I'm like 99.9% sure on the way I test too. So
I guess one of the criticisms of this might be, though, can you really boil down all of humanity to the 16 personality types? There's 7 billion people in the world. Like, does everyone on the planet, can you put them in these 16 categories?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, and that's where I kind of break away from the more popular MBTI model and delve into the finer points of differentiation. So, so the way I look at these personality types, if you want to refer to it that way, is as intelligent roles which have an underlying structure to them. So they're sort of like a metabolism of personality, which makes it possible for us to have, our basic experience of things. We need a part which breaks things down and a part which builds things up, takes in the raw data, breaks it down, and then makes it into something substantial. Um, so they're really, to me, they're not so much categories or personalities. That's just a manner of speaking, as they are activities. It's like looking at thoughts or the psyche as an activity and how it happens. And one of the ways that this can be approached is through this idea of you were talking a little bit about numerology earlier. It's not quite numerology in the sense of like a codified system used as a form of divination or prognostication of events, but looking at things as totalities that are comprised of a set number of points, I guess I would say. So in terms of activity, you could look at a structure, such as a personality, as being comprised of 4 sources, which are in a reciprocal relationship with one each other. Oh, and by the way, if you have any questions or I'm just babbling, just stop me. And because
No, I'm trying to get what you're saying. So there's each one is an activity. It's like an actual thing that you do.
It's something which is happening in process rather than something which is like fixed.
Okay, but if it's not fixed, then wouldn't people's personality types change all the time? Wouldn't it kind of just depend on what situation you're in?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure. I don't know, like I said earlier when I was talking about like the neuroscientific bases for these things. I don't know what causes a person to, take on the role of a specific personality type habitually. I don't know if it's like a prenatal thing or if it's something that's learned. I
Well,
know
that's the
that,
whole nature versus nurture question, right?
yeah, sort of. I mean, I remember I had a lot of the traits that my personality, my, quote, personality descriptor describes when I was very young. Like it could also almost be like a caricature for like that type. Like I remember one story my mom tells about me is that when I was a baby, she would sit me down in like a ring full of toys, and I would look at this the whole mic thing sounds really weird. This whole echo thing, it sounds like I'm like a on a spaceship, like I'm a zealot or something. I don't know. I don't know.
You can take the headphones off if you want.
I'm fine.
I really like the reverb personally.
Yeah. Well, it's okay, I guess. It's a slight latency thing, but anyway, yeah, she would sit me down in this ring of toys, and I would kind of just like look at the toys and not really go to play with any single one of them, but I would just kind of like sort of contemplate the toys and
That's pretty funny.
yeah, and which is characteristic, I think, of the personality type that I usually type as, which is considered a sort of contemplative, um, kind of risks not living life in the fullest kind of personality type. So I don't know what the basis for it is, so I can't really say. But what was I talking about before? Oh, activities. Okay, so the whole looking at things as um as like number structures is the most familiar idea probably in our common culture is that of the yin yang.
Right.
So, and that the two-ness expresses complementarity
Right.
or like the nature of a thing. So we can see how it's like the idea of it is you can't really have one without the other. That's like why there are the little dots and
Right.
the 2 eyes of the yin yang. So it's sort of like that similar idea where it's using a number to express a quality. In the case of 2, it's complementarity, but in the case of 4, it's activity, like a thing, like a it's rather than being like a binding polarity of 2, there's like a whole field where the points are sort of interacting. So you're moving from something which is static to something which is more interactive, where things happen.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in this discussion of like two-ness and four-ness, we're kind of moving on to the like the Gurdjieff or the Bennett thing, right?
Well, the basic idea, although there are different traces of it in other disciplines too, including significantly, I think, quantum physics. Um, the basic idea was developed by a philosopher slash mystic named John G. Bennett. He basically explored and mapped out.
Okay, so let's do a little background. So he was a follower of Gurdjieff, right?
Yeah, he was. Although I don't really want to go into a big biographical discussion of his because I'm not like super familiar with it.
Okay, so he was a mystic. He was 20. He lived in the 20th century, though, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so he came up with a number system that is kind of going along with what you're saying, where 2 has a complementary aspect and 4 has a aspect of activity, and kind of assigned these characteristics to numbers.
Well, it's not really like it's more, I'd say it's more of like a tool than a system. Like it's not like a fixed set of information, although there are certain things which are more constant, like they're more like principles in action. But the idea of it is exploring the quantitative, or I'm sorry, rather the qualitative aspects that numbers carry rather than like their strictly quantitative aspects. Like you
Okay.
could look at 1 as universality, or 2 as complementarity, 3 he said was relationship, and 4 he says
How is
describes activity.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna go through this with you. Why is 3 relationship? And I'm gonna tell you too. I'm intrigued by 3 because when you're talking about the yin yang, when I was in Japan, I noticed that they had a yin yang there that was there was 3 tomes, I believe they're called. There was 3 of those blobs instead of 2, and it was a circle just like that, but it was 3. It was almost like kind of like the Klingon symbol from Star Trek. If you saw that. Um, but yeah, I was kind of intrigued by that, and they also have in part of their mythology there's the goddess of the sun, the god of the moon, and the god of the ocean, and they're brothers and sister. And there's kind of this threeness to different parts of their mythology.
hmm
So you said 3 represents relationship. Why is that?
Well, it's partly a progression from the binding polarity of 2ness. So you could have, like, you see this in politics a lot. You could have an issue come up, and there are like 2 sides of it. Well, I think this is good, but I also think this is good. So, it's just sort of like a static bind where nothing really happens.
Right.
The third term introduces a possible reconciliation of the 2. So the 2 together don't really like speak to each other, as you might describe it like that. But the third term allows a relationship which makes action possible.
Okay.
And so really action is a characterizing.
So it's kind of like the common ground for 2 points to meet in, or something like that.
It's not really like a common ground. It's not like a middle point between the 2 sides of like two polar opposites.
Okay.
It's more like something which allows them to communicate without destroying what they are.
Okay.
Like you might think of it, one example is, for example, 2 islands that are connected by a bridge.
Right.
The islands remain what they are, but the bridge makes a sort of commerce and communication possible between them, which allows for different types of activity.
Okay, that makes sense. So why is 4 activity, or how would you characterize that concept?
Well, 4 is actually a little bit less complicated than 3 because it's just a doubling of 2. It's really like a splitting of 2 into 2 more. So instead of a binary um, sort of polar kind of relationship, it represents something which is sort of continuously a progression which is continuously happening. So characteristically, the terms of the fourness, which we'll call tetrads, the different points all have different, they're not just four arbitrary points, they have specific qualities.
Right.
And so imagine an equilateral cross. And on the bottom of the cross is a point which you can call fact. On the left side of the cross is a point which you can call, there are so many, technique, let's say. On the right side of the cross, there's a point which you can call theory. And on the top, there's a point which you can call value. So all of these different sources interact with each other in such a way and carry on reciprocal relationships. Like it's not just the points on the ends of the crosses, but like there are also like diagonals that connect between,
Right.
say, the facts and the theory and the fact and the technique that allow this sort of constant flow of activity to occur.
So what I think about when you're describing this
Mhm.
is politics, actually, because there's something in politics called the Nolan chart, which kind of displays how politics isn't one dimensional. There's not just a right and a left. There are actually four different values on the sides of like a square, or if you can imagine like a diamond.
Mhm.
There are four different value propositions on each side. So capitalism on one side, then you have like religion on the side below that. Then on the other side, you would have like community in the sense of like labor or something like that. I guess you'd say like communism or socialism. And then on the other side of that, across from religion, on like the other side of the diamond, you would have sort of like individual freedom in the sense of like, you know, gay rights or, you know, being able to use drugs or stuff like that.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what I'm thinking about when you're describing this. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel there where that represents some kind of like political activity in that sense, like these different values communicating with each other or something along those lines.
I'm not sure. It might be interesting to explore, though. It certainly lends credence to the idea that to get away from, the problems that polarity presents is to sort of, start to look at these different terms that are happening.
Hmm.
Um, but really, the tetrad is actually two axes of polarity in dialogue with each other happening simultaneously. Because on the one hand, you have fact and value, which are on the, what's the name for it, the vertical line. And on the other hand, you have technique and theory on the horizontal line, which are kind of mutually complementary ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I would think they would be kind of more opposite type things. So you're saying theory and technique are on the same axis?
Yes, meaning that they are both mutually exclusive and they explain each other because they interpenetrate each other.
Okay. And then fact and
Fact and value.
how
So
it
it's like the material of the activity against the end goal or final result of the activity.
all right.
So, for example, if you were to look at cooking as a tetrad, like the material point would be represented by the actual ingredients that you're using. Which, if you want to look at in an anthropological sense, would be like whatever that cooking tradition had around when it began, which is usually dictated by a geography. That's like the material of it. And the end goal of cooking is like the meal. So the idea behind the activity is to transform the raw ingredients into something which is nutritious.
Okay.
And the technique side of it would be like the kitchen and the tools, the things, the inner part of the activity that holds it together. Like you can't really, you can't really cook without a kitchen. Well, I guess you could, but the makeshift working space that you make would functionally be the kitchen, even if it's not like a kitchen in quotations. And then the theory side would be like, the recipes that develop out of the tradition, and the different schools and the different tastes that kind of spring out of it too, which is sort of concerned with what is happening on the outside of the activity. So that you have material, technique, theory, and value, which, by the way, are only like it's only one way of describing these terms. Like there are many other ways too that you find in different philosophical schools. For example, Aristotle would say that when he was describing cause and effect, he described four kinds of causality, which were, I think his words were, the material cause, the formative cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause, which are, the material, the technique, the theory, and the value, respectively.
Okay. So how does this relate to Myers-Briggs?
Well, it has to do with the way that the function orders that Jung talks about in his original theory are structured, and the way they interact with each other.
So to break this down, you're talking about these four different things, like fact and value and technique. Do these relate to the different Myers-Briggs axes with intuition and or introversion and extroversion, stuff like that?
I think they do. Yes,
Okay.
I think they do.
So what are the correlations?
Well, the basic correlation. Well, first of all, Jung in his psychology work distinguished four functions, which are thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And probably, I would say, sensation corresponds to the material side of the activity, if we're looking at the psyche as an activity. Feeling corresponds to technique. Thinking corresponds to theory. And intuition corresponds to value.
Okay.
So that would be like the basic model. And the attitudes of the functions, which are introversion and extroversion, change up a little bit. And that represents another kind of duality that plays into it. There are a lot of 2s and 4s in this. So each personality type has a different preference structure, which are typically described as being in stacks. So, for example, an INFP, you would describe as a person who prefers introverted feeling as their primary function, followed by extroverted intuition, then introverted sensation, and finally the fourth function would be extroverted thinking, as like a stack. So it's presented as being like a hierarchical kind of order. But what I am sort of getting at is that it's actually not a stack as much as it is one of these tetrads we've been talking about.
Right.
So for an INFP, the function in the value place is introverted feeling. The function in the theory place is extroverted intuition. The function in the technique place is introverted sensation. And the function in the material place is extroverted thinking. So rather than being preferences in a hierarchy, they are terms in a relationship which relate to each other in specific and differentiated ways that allow us to help understand the finer workings of the personality.
Okay, so there's relationship, at least did Bennett say that there's a relationship between this and Myers-Briggs? Did he point that out?
It is actually an example in one of his books. Like he said, he was using examples of, fourness being like a theme in different schools and
Right.
different forms of thought and stuff. And that was one of the things like Jung's four functions. He didn't really go into as much depth about it as I have over the past year, but it was just kind of like a passing thing. And I just kind of took it and ran with it.
By the way, folks, if you enjoyed tonight's conversations or any other Primo Nutmeg podcasts, please do follow us on Twitter at Primo Nutmeg. But I think I followed you and you hadn't posted anything for like like 9 months or something.
Yeah, I haven't posted in a long time. There was a time where I was kind of like posting these little tidbits of things,
You're
but
not on Facebook anymore either.
I am.
Well, I mean, I never see you on Facebook anymore either.
Yeah, I don't really post that much. Typically, either I encounter conversations that I have no interest in, that I think they're just kind of like, polemic fighting, or conversations that are so interesting and in depth that I
Well,
just have nothing to say
let me tell you
to
something.
contribute.
Uh, there are two individuals who have had epic Facebook battles. I think you might know the two I'm talking about.
Yes, but I can't say
And
one of their names.
I'm trying to get the two of them to appear on this podcast. I would like to sit down with them because they have these rants against each other on Facebook.
Yeah.
Where it gets one person will insult the other, then the other will start swearing and using caps lock, and it's not very productive. I'd like to actually have them sit down and talk in person. I think it would be more of like a human dialogue, as opposed to.
Well, it would definitely be a different medium, that's for sure, than sort of the chess by mail format of Facebook that tends to occur.
Have you been in Facebook fights before? They're normally, I mean, all the ones I've been in have been political.
I usually try to make it a point not to get into protracted arguments, which is why I post so infrequently, because usually if I have an idea about the thing, it's usually kind of radical in a way, because if it weren't, then I could just let the people argue about the points that they already have, and that would be okay. But if I post something that's like really sort of like different, then I feel like there are just like so many things, and it's just gonna like turn into this, squabble where like individual lines are being parsed out. And that's
Well, you know what too is people they get so emotional. It's really aggravating because I try to have reasoned discussions with people and be self-deprecating and stuff, but if you don't go along with what someone's worldview is and don't make these caveats to what they're saying, they get very emotional and hostile.
Yeah, that's happened to me before, like unintentionally offending people. I think, one of the drawbacks of online communication is that we tend to dehumanize each other in a way.
Yeah.
Like we just become like
Texting is like that too. I mean, even personally, I've texted things to people, during arguments that I would never say in person.
Well, it's not only that, it's like we start to see people in terms of like categories.
Yeah. Well, were we just talking about this whole podcast?
Well, yeah, just bringing it back full circle. This is particularly true of like, internet or, cyber communities, that we tend to, without the face-to-face interaction, it just becomes like, I'm super right-wing anarcho guy, or I'm super liberal guy, or whatever. We amplify our personality traits, and we just kind of like become those things. So when a person says something contradictory, it's like, you are the kind of person that is ruining the world. I
know, yeah, and that's kind of why I'm somewhat ambivalent about all like these categories, because I know when we do label people, it turns into that.
Yep.
And you're when you have conversations, I try to. I mean, I'm at the point where I'm really trying to avoid any kind of labels. I don't really agree with any party or dogma. I don't think that much.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes, like, if I'll disagree with someone, let's say I disagree with a Democrat, and say something, they'll start arguing against me like I'm a Republican, even though I'm not.
Yeah.
Or if I start arguing against a Republican, they'll use talking points against me like I'm a Democrat, but I'm not.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. It's ridiculous. That's why I would like to have the two of them sit down and actually have a conversation. I think it might be more productive than these short little Facebook exchanges. However, the person who lives in Boston does not want to sit down with the person from Middletown.
Is he a listener to your show?
I don't think so. I mean, I sent him the link for the first one. I think you might have listened to a little bit, but another problem with technology nowadays is that we don't take in things that we disagree with. We only draw from the pool of media that we like to consume, and we don't want to hear anything else from anyone else because it's suspect. And
Yeah, it's an interesting flip side to the burgeoning of information technology, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, I see both sides of it. I think it's a good thing to have alternative viewpoints, but it's a bad thing when we have citizens who will not take into consideration all these different perspectives that are out there.
Well, you were saying that you basically look at it like people can just kind of like, or my takeaway was that people can just kind of find what they want,
Right.
and that kind of becomes since they have so much control over the media that they consume, that it becomes sort of like almost like a bubble.
But it's a good thing insofar as we don't just all have to believe what the New York Times says, for example.
Right.
Like that's how it was 70 years ago, is whatever your newspaper said was fact, and that was it. Now there are a lot of different viewpoints, but people are only going to one general source. They aren't willing to look what BBC is saying and then look what I don't know, the Chinese news services are saying, and look at what RT is saying. They're just looking, at their Fox News or MSNBC or whatever.
Yeah, or whatever, whatever Reddit boards they browse or whatever Facebook groups they have. Or yeah, I think it's it's a natural consequence of just the way our habitual thinking works.
Right.
It's a pretty common idea that we don't really think about things first and then form our conclusions. We have our convictions first, and then we go out and seek the evidence to support those, or generally, like most of the time, in our routine ways of operating. So there is definitely that hazard side to it.
Well, we're gonna have to bring our podcast to a close pretty soon because there's some UFC fights that are on. I don't know if you.
Oh, has it been 20 minutes already?
It's been 2 hours. It's been a 2-hour podcast.
Time flies by.
Yeah, there's some UFC fights tonight. Before we end, though, I do want to ask you something.
Okay.
There's also a big WWE pay-per-view tonight.
Oh.
It's the rematch of Brock Lesnar and The Undertaker.
Oh, wow.
I was wondering if you had a...
Got my smarky take on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's amazing that The Undertaker is still wrestling. He's been The Undertaker for like 25 years now.
How old is he now?
I can Google that, but he's got how old do you think he is?
Oh, he's got to be in his 50s, I'd imagine.
I'm gonna say he's 60. Let's see what the Wikipedia says. But yeah, he's been around forever. I've remembered him wrestling since I was a kid. I don't know about you.
Oh, there's a deer in the backyard. That's cool. On Deer Run Drive.
The Undertaker he's only 50. Wow.
Oh.
Jeez, I thought he was 60. He was born in 1965.
Well, he's taken a lot of bumps, so he probably looks much older than he actually is.
I guess so. But he has a big rematch tonight against Brock Lesnar. I don't know if the last time you ever watched wrestling or looked up anything about
floats
wrestling.
In and out. It's kind of professional wrestling is kind of like a crazy uncle or something. Like, it's been around me like my whole life, so occasionally I'll like go and I'll look in and see like, hey, what's so and so been up to today? Oh yeah, that's pretty nuts. Oh well, and then I'll just go back to whatever.
So The Undertaker had this undefeated streak at WrestleMania where I don't know when they realized it, but they were booking him every year to win at WrestleMania.
Yeah.
So after several years, it started to be this gimmick where he was undefeated at WrestleMania, and every year he'd be challenged. And he had some big matches against Triple H. He actually had 2 against Shawn Michaels, and one of them, Shawn Michaels retired afterwards because he couldn't beat The Undertaker and finish his streak. But I guess there was, I don't know if it's legitimate or not, but there was some beef between The Undertaker and Brock Lesnar, where Brock Lesnar actually showed up to a UFC event and I guess, kind of stared down. The Undertaker showed up at a UFC event and kind of stared down Brock Lesnar. So when Brock Lesnar was done with UFC, he came back to the WWE, and they set up a match for WrestleMania of Brock Lesnar against The Undertaker. And Brock Lesnar actually beat The Undertaker at WrestleMania 30, which was in 2014. So now they're actually having a rematch for SummerSlam tomorrow.
I'm surprised they did it at SummerSlam, though, you know? You think they would...
I'm thinking, if I had to guess, I think that The Undertaker went to Vince McMahon and said, I want to beat Brock Lesnar. So they're just doing it at SummerSlam.
I thought he was it was kind of his idea, though, that he wanted Brock to win at WrestleMania.
Vince McMahon?
No, Undertaker.
I read that it was McMahon's decision. McMahon wanted to, he set up, it was like a year-long thing where he wanted to set up the next match for a year later that had to do with Brock Lesnar. So he wanted him to beat The Undertaker first. They kind of did that with The Rock, too, where The Rock was like a special guest referee at I forget, WrestleMania 28, and then he came back at WrestleMania 29.
You'd figure you want the loss to be what the thing is building up to, though, not like the beginning of the build-up.
Well, for tonight, I think that what it is The Undertaker wants to just have a win over Brock Lesnar. I don't think he ever beat him. So he just wants that to be part of his legacy or something. I don't even know why he's still really wrestling. Like, guys, there aren't many old timers left. Most of them are retired. Yeah. Ric Flair's retired. Hulk Hogan's retired. Sting had his retirement match at this past WrestleMania. I think Triple H is pretty much done. Like, all the guys that we grew up watching or who were wrestling when we were teenagers, Steve Austin, they're all retired.
Yeah. It's kind of like, you know, how I haven't watched baseball in like 15 years and I go back and like none of the same all-stars are like there anymore.
Yeah.
Like, what am I even watching anymore? But yeah, I mean,
so
I think it makes sense.
I'm going with The Undertaker to win tonight. Who are you going with?
Oh, I think there's going to be like a run-in or something, and they're going to have to do something at WrestleMania.
Really?
Yeah.
That would be interesting, actually.
I don't think it's going to be like a clean, decisive win for either guy. They're not going to do something like that.
And since you brought up baseball, I'm calling for the World Series. It's going to be Royals Cardinals. Who are you predicting for that?
I heard the Royals are doing very good this year.
So there are 4 teams with at least 70 wins right now. One is in the American League. That's the Kansas City Royals. The other 3 are in the National League Central Division. It's the Cardinals, the Pirates, and the Cubs.
Wow.
So that's actually kind of interesting, too, because the way that they're doing playoffs now is there's 2 wild card spots per league, and those 2 teams have a 1-game playoff. So technically, 3 National League Central Division teams are going to the postseason, which is kind of strange.
Well, 2 of them are, right?
No, 3 of them, because 2 of them are going to have a wild card 1-game playoff. It's going to be the Pirates and the Cubs are going to have a 1-game playoff.
Oh, that's what you're saying. Okay.
And then from there, they'll advance to the regular division series that are best 3 out of 5. So just throw a couple teams out. Who are you predicting for the World Series?
Pirates, Royals.
Okay, good call. All right, folks. Well, thank you for joining us for another edition of Primo Nutmeg. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Chris, you sure you don't want to throw out your Twitter handle?
Oh, I'm sure. This is all of me that you're getting. So if you have any interest in anything I've talked about or whatever, this is it. So you're out of luck. Sorry.
So stay tuned for future editions of Primo Nutmeg. You can also check out the Robocast. I don't know if you've ever heard that, Chris.
I have.
But
he's good.
Playing us out tonight, in honor of what would have been my great-grandfather's 90th birthday, is a track off of an album that he released in 1984. This is Bobby Kay and the Swing Street Orchestra with Drum Drone.